and welcome to The Apex, a weekly conversation with the titans and tastemakers of the automotive world. This week, we're delighted to host Formula One driver, Le Mans winner, artist and designer Stefan Johansson. Stefan's long and varied racing career has taken him all over the world and has seen him race incredible machinery with some of the greatest names in motorsport. To top it all off, after stepping away from driving duties, he has had a successful career as a painter and watch designer, while continuing to share his wisdom and experience as manager of a number of talented pro racing drivers. Stefan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
So my first question is, you're one of the most experienced racing drivers in the world. You've raced in everything from Formula One to sports cars to CART. How did a young Stefan Johansson first enter the world of cars and racing?
Well, I sort of grew up with it. My dad was racing, club racing back in Sweden. So, I used to go to races with him when I was 3-4 years old and kind of just lived in that world already, on a smaller scale, obviously. But I was also playing a lot of ice hockey, like everybody does in Sweden. That's kind of the national sport over there, and did quite well. So it was only when I was about 18, I think I made the choice, to kind of choose the racing career rather than trying to pursue a career in ice hockey, as a professional player or whatever. So that's kind of when I took it really serious, I guess, around that age.
So is that something you did with your family? Would you be working on cars together, taking them to the racetrack, that kind of thing?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, it was definitely a family affair. We used to have a caravan that we kind of modified into half a transporter for the go-karts, underneath the beds. And it was looking back at it now, it was actually a great time, because everybody was doing the same thing. So it was a good atmosphere, in the paddock, everybody's hanging out and all the families were there, So it was a nice way to grow up, actually.
And so what was the moment where you thought, oh, I could do this professionally?
Yeah, I don't know if there was one watershed moment when I realized, it's a progressive thing, I think. You sort of start in karting, and then that went quite well. I got, the Swedish national team and raced against, it's funny because, in my latter couple of years in karting, I used to race against Eddie Cheever, Alain Prost, Didier Pironi, Elio De Angelis, all Patrese, all the guys that eventually ended up in Formula One, so it was
so you knew it was coming.
But it's such great training, because karting, and in those days, I'm sure it's the same now, the entire field was covered by, if you 1/10 could be the difference between, making the finals or be on, front row, basically. It was crazy how competitive it was.
So you ended up meeting them later on down the line.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So speaking of that, so your professional Formula One career, it took place in the 1980s. And I think that's a time that many of us see as a golden era in that sport. How would you describe that decade in racing to a younger listener who only really knows modern Formula One? Tell us about the differences between now and then.
Well, it's different. It's huge, obviously. The technology wasn't anything remotely like it is today. The cars were wild in terms of, all cars back then, not just F1 cars, but Group C cars, sports cars. Everything was just, big horsepower. And, aero wasn't, very unsophisticated, and of course we had the wing cars, with the sliding skirts, which produce an enormous amount of downforce, but that was banned when I came into Formula One. So it was all about big horsepower, in 85 and 85 in particular, before they put any limit on the boost pressure, in qualifying, we, literally just put a plate over the wastegate, so there was no control whatsoever. The amount of boost you got is what you managed to produce, basically, so I remember some races we had over 1,500 horsepower in qualifying. That's and, even at Monza, which is a super high speed track with long gears, we used to get wheel spin between fifth and sixth gear when you shift from fifth to sixth in the straight with one lap qualifiers. Literally the rear would just light up, it was crazy. But unbelievably exciting cars to drive, of course, they were just raw, brutal, crazy cars,
And was it one of those situations where you'd have a good insight into what the other teams were doing as well? Because you look at photos from back in the day and the paddock is just full of people. There's like fans, engineers, everyone's milling about. What kind of organization was there?
Well, I don't think we knew as much as teams know now probably about each other, because the espionage that's going on today is, way, way beyond anything that you could even, the technology didn't exist then, so it wasn't something you could even think about. We didn't even have mobile phones for the most part of that era, so everything was very, very basic. There was no data. I wish I had data when I was teammates with Alain Prost, for example, to figure out what the hell he was doing. It would have been a lot easier, because literally you just had to rely on your field, and what you relayed back to the engineers. That was pretty much the data you had to go by,
Yeah, so it was just kind of seat of the pants feeling if you're in the car.
Yeah, very much so, yeah.
And so also you had manual shifting in those cars as well.
Yeah.
Presumably you had to learn how to get quite good at that, given the speed.
Yeah, huge component of the lap time, in fact. Yeah, especially in qualifying, because you want, but when you had all that power, you couldn't, literally couldn't shift quick enough, And I remember I used to spend days down at the factory of Ferrari in Maranello on my own, preparing the shift forks, inside the gearbox, just to kind of, because you have a mental picture of what you do, when you, especially second to third, because it's cross gate. If you get caught there, and you kind of have to just go one step and then another one, that's half a second gone, So in qualifying, it was huge, if you could just shift as quick as you possibly could,
Yeah,
I spent days filing the forks on my own, and kind of, because you have a mental idea of, and I used to sit in the car for hours and just memorize the shift, and just, because that was one of the key components to a quick lap time, in fact.
So a good amount of time spent filing the shifter mechanism.
Yeah,
so that's extraordinary with a Ferrari.
Yeah, well, because it's hard to explain. You just you kind of know what you want. It was just more efficient to do it on your own. Just to kind of get it right.
So did you have a moment where
I thought would be right?
Did you have a moment where you would come back to the pit and you'd say, "I think that was fast," and then you'd have to look at the clock to see like whether it just felt fast or whether it was like that kind of.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. But like at Monaco, for example, you come after, because you only got one lap on the qualis back then. So you go out, you do your qualifying lap, and you come in, and then sort of Tom Maini, who was my engineer, how is the car? And I said, you're fucking kidding. It's like, it's just the lap is just a blur, because literally you're just holding on for dear life. Wheel spin all the way up the hill. You just keep shifting. Yeah. And you just keep your foot down and you just keep feeding the gears, because if you lift and you try to correct, the car is never pointing straight. It was just going, sliding one end to the other all the way up the hill. And if it for some reason would have grabbed when you were pointing 45 degrees towards the wall, you would have just smacked the wall and, going even on the straight going up the hill. So it was just, you just kept your foot in it basically, and just kept feeding the gears until you get to the top, and try to gather it up. It was literally just seat to the pants, just holding on the whole way, no car feel. And none of that really mattered almost, because it was just pure horsepower, that's all that mattered.
I think that's a really vivid description. So yeah, talking of Ferrari, you raced for Ferrari and McLaren in your time, these great teams. What are your favorite memories of racing for those teams? And what was it like meeting Enzo in person? And you mentioned Alain Prost, but also people like Gordon Murray and Ron Dennis. What was it like working with those people?
Oh, it was fantastic, of course, because they were the top, the best of the best. Meeting Enzo Ferrari, of course, is for any driver was an amazing experience, and to be picked by him to drive for his team at the stage where I was in my career, was a dream come true, obviously,
It's almost like a movie, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. And, he was the master of the sort of the drama and the mystique, and it was everything with him was like a Fellini movie, it was like
dark rooms, light.
Yeah, and it was exactly that. Yeah. When I met him the first time, it was a secret meeting in the old factory in Modena, not the one in Maranello, which is just just basically sitting there dormant, but he still had his office there. So we decided to have the meeting there the first time, and it was, you walk through this corridor, and it's like 5 PM, sun's sort of setting, and you have sun rays coming in, all pictures of Nuvolari, Fangio, Moss, all the guys, and it's sort of goosebumps just walking through the corridor. And then he's in his room in the very back, dark, no lights on. You can just see the silhouette, and it's like, I don't think it was meant to be that way, but it was just that
it just happened
so
that way.
Dramatic, everything.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
And also, I know that you had Ayrton Senna as a teammate at Tolleman for a while, and also during the '84 Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So, what made him so special? How much kind of interaction did you have with him, and what were your impressions of him when you first saw his driving?
Well, I mean, he obviously had, from very early on, from karting days, a lot of people are already aware of him, and then Formula Ford. Mm-hmm. He had an extraordinary amount of raw talent, obviously, just an incredible amount of feel, and kind of developed his own technique, this sort of stabbing the throttle all the way through the corner, which in the turbo era was particularly efficient, because you kept the turbo spooled up all the time. But it was just more his personality. And had he been a banker, he would have been the best banker in the world, basically. It was just that mental attitude he had, that was just totally uncompromising, just win, which in my personal opinion was maybe his detriment in the end, that it was like win at all costs, at all times, but he was extremely efficient at what he did and relentless in his pursuit to be the best at all times, and that's what made him very, I think Schumacher was a bit the same, Alain Prost was the same, and I think Lewis is now the same, those guys have maybe a few percent more raw talent than the rest, but, the real difference is really in their mental attitude, and they're willing to work 10%, 20% harder than the rest of them, and just never, ever accept anything but being the best, and that's what makes the difference.
Did you ever find any of the other drivers maybe quietly trying to imitate some of his techniques in those turbo cars, or do you think it was?
Well, I think everybody did in a way, I applied that technique a little bit too, it was effective because, the turbo lag was quite massive, especially when you had, the boost cranked up all the way, in qualifying. So if you could get them spooled up just a little bit before you nail it, then that would help just to diminish the lag for, maybe half a second or a few tenths each time, So it was efficient for sure.
So just moving on to your sports car racing career, it saw you drive an incredible array of cars with a win at Le Mans with Joest in 1997 in a TWR Porsche to top it all off. Of all your Le Mans drives, which car was the best to drive and which was the most difficult, and why?
Well, the best one was probably the Audi R8 because that was just a phenomenal car in every aspect. Audi was just an incredible company to work with. They're just so professional in every way. And the car when you arrive at the track was pretty much perfect when you roll it off the truck everywhere. And then you fiddle about with it as you do in practice, and a little understeer, do this, change that. But when you roll it back in the truck after the race, the setup was virtually identical to how you rolled it out of the truck at the beginning of the weekend. They were just so good to work with. And it was a comfortable car, and well sorted, and everything was just like even simple things, like where all the buttons were for the switches and everything was very logical. So when it's dark at Le Mans, sometimes, it's, you got to know where everything is, and it's, most cars aren't like that, because most cars is like, oh crap, we forgot that switch, and you sort of, well, there's an empty space over there, so let's just drill a hole and put it there.
Ruthless practicality.
Yeah, exactly. But none of that, everything was just perfect on this car,
And what about cars that maybe were a bit more of a tough thing to learn, or a bit more of a struggle, or
I've had plenty of those at Le Mans, I can assure you. Which is, yeah, some of them was just like you take your life into your hands every time you leave the pit lane. It felt like, yeah. I mean, a lot of them weren't very sorted, so it was, and Le Mans is a daunting track, because the speed is so high. So if the car is not right, I mean, it's magnified several times more than you would have it, let's say, a regular track like even Silverstone, which is quite demanding as well, but, or any sort of regular European road course, if you like.
Yeah. If you're going down the Mulsanne and you don't have faith in your setup, then exactly, I can imagine that's pretty scary, especially at night with people zooming past. Yeah.
Well, because you also got the crown and the road, which makes it tricky, because it's not even on the straight, the car is kind of a handful, if it's not sorted properly and the aero is not right on it, Yeah.
So I know as well that you've raced some legendary cars like the Porsche 956 and the rotary-engined Mazda 787B. I mean, for many of us, those are like dream racing cars. They're like on the bedroom wall. One day I wish I'll see one in real life. How do you describe the experience of driving that Porsche or that Mazda to someone whose racing experience is, kind of rudimentary? What makes them so special?
Well, the 956 was the first of the sort of really amazing cars in that era, because it was it had plenty of downforce, which was at the beginning of that whole period. But I mean, it was the first year I did it was without the chicanes as well at Le Mans, which so I don't know. I still may have the record. I had the record for a long time. Top speed, it was like 408 kilometers.
Wow.
In qualifying, right? That when you go out for the second session, when it's still sort of daylight. I got a huge tow off Hans Stuck and the boost cranked up full, with qualifiers and everything. And he told me the whole Mulsanne all the way down, said, I mean, you don't really think about the speed, generally speaking, because you get used to it, but that felt fast, I can assure you. Especially going through the kink, because it's still flat, but I mean, you use all the road you can to keep your foot in it at that speed,
And were those cars sort of a really physical experience as well, or were they relatively easy, light to drive?
No, they were physical because they had no power steering and they had like massive caster, like 14 degrees of caster. So the steering was unbelievably heavy on them, which was more like a place like Nürburgring, for example, the Nordschleife. I mean, you couldn't hold the wheel in your hand like you normally do. It'll just rip out of your hands because of all the bumps at the Nürburgring, those long undulating bumps you have there. So you used to have to hold the steering in the spokes, literally grab the spokes inside, and that was the only way you could actually hold the wheel in your hand. That's when you went down the long straight towards the Swedenkreuz, and then it's flat all the way through the left-hander going into the braking area. Yeah. And you just physically could not hold the wheel in your hand the normal way. You had to just yank the spoke down with your hand, to be able to hold on to it. And you're doing 360 Ks or something while you do that, it's like crazy fast,
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, presumably, just going back to Formula One for a moment, it's the same thing there, isn't it? It's all incredibly physical.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was more than because of the manual shift, obviously. And again, we had no power steering or anything. So the worst part is the feedback you get in the steering, because every little sand corn, gets feedback in the steering, whereas the power steering takes out a lot of that, so it's a lot more comfort in the car when you got power steering, of course.
I mean, in a race car, what do you prefer?
Well, from a purist point of view, I prefer no power steering and manual shift and everything, because it's when that went away, that took out a lot of the skill elements for a driver, especially the shifting. Shifting was a huge part in going fast, fast on a qualifying lap, but also keeping it together in the race. Because now you can't miss a gear. It's impossible unless something malfunctions in the system. Whereas that was normally a missed shift was typically your opportunity to pass the guy in front of you in F1. You just harass them and you just, constantly trying to break their rhythm, so that eventually at some point they would miss an upshift and that was your chance to pass them,
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. And so moving on from the racing, you're famous for your activities outside it as well, including painting and watch design. What attracted you to those other disciplines?
Well, I was always interested in it, like I think every person, whatever their professional career is, you always have other interests or hobbies, let's say, that may, occupy some of your time away from whatever you do for a living, let's say. So I was always interested in art and design more just as a participant, as a spectator than a participant, let's say. But the arts really started when I was very close with Elio De Angelis. We were good buddies, we were racing F1. And when he got killed, then, that affected me pretty badly. And for whatever reason, I don't even know to this day what prompted me to go and buy a canvas and some paint, and try to do something in his memory. But that's kind of how it got started, actually. Mm-hmm. And then, I got hooked on it pretty early on because I found it very therapeutic, to kind of take your mind off things between races and stuff. So I then started just painting in my apartment, and did some various bits and pieces, and that's just sort of grown over time, But it was always kind of my whole racing career, it was more a hobby than anything else. Mm-hmm. And it's only in the recent sort of 5 or 6 years I've really started to take it more serious as a vocation, and selling my stuff. I wasn't really comfortable selling what I did early on anyway. So, but I think I've found a style now that I feel comfortable and I'm willing to show other people, without being sort of ashamed of what I'm doing.
and the watch design as well. How did that come about?
Well, it's not similar, but I've, like most guys,
most guys like
cars
watches.
And watches is kind of the thing for guys, isn't it?
Yeah.
Girls like their bags and their shoes, so it's cars and watches is our thing. And so I collected a few watches along the way, and then I was actually approached by a company in Switzerland at the tail end of my F1 career to kind of endorse or be an ambassador or whatever for their brand. But the watches they had was not really the style that I like, let's say. So I said, well, why don't we try to collaborate and maybe we can do some, a joint sort of design venture out of it, So that's really how it got started. Mm-hmm. And then I decided to just do it on my own rather than, with another brand. And and then I've just been doing it ever since. Yeah.
No, I think they've proved quite popular. I know there's a watch you have with all of the racing flags around the dial.
Yeah, that's very popular. That's kind of the best seller. For sure.
I bet other watch companies are kicking themselves that they didn't think of.
Well, it's funny, because I'm quite good friends with a lot of them. A lot of the big brands. The obvious ones who's involved in racing, and they've all looked at doing the same, and then they find that I've actually protected the design. And you bastard, we wanted to do the same one, Yeah.
Never compete with a racing driver.
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing. And how does your mindset compare when you're creating a good work of art or designing something and driving? Is the same part of your brain working? Is there some sort of connection there?
There is actually, yeah. It is quite similar in many ways, because when you get into that sort of the zone, if you like, it's a bit of a cliche, but when you get into that state of mind, it's very similar, because you kind of, it's for me, it's just solitude, it's just me. When I'm in my studio, I never have any music on, and just silence. So it's kind of almost a meditative state, when you really when things starts to flow, when I'm painting or whatever. And it's very, very similar when you race the car, because you get into that same state of mind, and you just kind of lose all sense of space and time, and you just one with the car. You feel everything. It's like you're almost on some kind of a wonder drug, where every sense in your body is magnified massively. Vision, hearing, smell, everything, all the elements just come together. And it's all part of what you do with the car.
Yeah.
And when you paint, it's actually quite similar to that. Once you get the flow, it takes me a lot longer to get dialed in when I paint, and because I've been driving cars my whole life since I was a little kid, but the painting is, I need to it's a bit of a grind sometimes to get it going. But once I get it going, then the same thing, you lose. I've been in my studio, and before I know it, it's 6 o'clock in the morning. You just have completely lose all, it just starts flowing, and it's a wonderful space to be in.
Yeah, that sounds like a really special experience. I mean, we've had some guests on the podcast who make music.
Yeah,
they're into cars. There seems to be this interesting kind of creative connection between. These.
I think it's all very similar in the end. Whether you're because driving a race car is a bit of a form of an art, in fact, in that way. Because you just use your senses. You improvise all the time, although every lap is the same, but it's never the same. It's always, there's always, but those are the things that you're on full alert the whole time. But I think it's the same if you're a rider, musician, so many different forms of art. I think it all connects to the same source at the end,
That kind of purity, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So we're coming up on time now, and we always end up with some quick fire questions. So I've got 3 here that you might enjoy. So the first one is, if you could go back and relive one race from your career, which one would it be and why?
Well, probably my second race with Ferrari, when I was leading at Imola and I ran out of fuel. Because had I known I had a little crack in the inlet manifold, I would have, and I could have, because if I ever drove a perfect race, that was probably the one, because I was absolutely spot on with the fuel consumption. And we still had plenty left, so I could have actually just accommodated more for that. But, that's, shoulda, coulda, woulda. It's one of those things, but had I won that race, I think everything would have changed dramatically, not only for me, because the first one is always the hardest one, knowing that you can win a Grand Prix, but also the dynamic inside the team would have changed completely. It's all those little things, that makes a huge difference in the bigger picture.
Yeah. And it was just a mechanical.
Yeah, what happened was there was a crack in the inlet manifold that was sucking in air. So, of course, the engine then compensated for that with pushing in more fuel to have the same mixture, the air-fuel mixture. So that, according to our calculation, we were absolutely bang on the whole time, on how much fuel I was using every lap. Yeah.
Well, if we ever get a time machine, then we'll be sure to invite you along to that. The second question is what is one piece of advice you'd give to a driver who wants to be competitive on a racing grid?
I think be true to yourself, first of all, and if you don't try to bullshit yourself with a bunch of excuses, if you're not feeling like you're good enough, but if you really feel in your heart, in your gut, that you can do this and you can win races, then never give up. Just keep going, because the door will eventually open. If you just don't give up, something will eventually happen, and just keep willing it, because it'll happen.
Brilliant. And the third quickfire question is, who is your favorite artist, and who or what inspires you most now in your creative endeavors?
Well, my favorite artist is someone he's not very well known, but his prices are through the roof. But it's an artist called Mark Tansey, American artist. If you look it up, his art is amazing. It's really cool, very figurative, large canvases. But his subjects and the way he puts the whole thing together is really, really interesting. And his technique is fantastic, because I like figurative as well, quite detailed. So yeah, he's amazing. But as far as inspiration, it comes from everywhere, really. I read a lot, so if I see something that suddenly pops up at me, so the figurative paintings I do now, these quotes, for example. So if I see something, that could turn into a painting, then it could be. So it's really it's like if you write a song, you start with the lyrics and then add the music, rather than the other way around. And it's kind of the same thing, so if I see something that makes me kind of react, whether and then hopefully that'll translate to the viewer, where whatever the reaction may be, make them laugh, angry, thoughtful, sad, whatever it may be, but that's kind of what I'm trying to achieve with that. And then I add the portrait of that person, afterwards. So it's kind of interaction between the text and the portrait, you know, that I'm doing with these particular paintings. So inspiration comes from everywhere. I mean, it could be walking down the street in a strange city somewhere, you see something, you know, and it's just, it can be anything really, you know, it just depends on what you see and what state of mind you're in at the time, I guess, you know.
That's the soul and mind of the artist, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe it is. Yeah, I don't know.
And so, and there we have it. Our time is up, so all that's left for me to do is to say thank you very much, Stefan, for such an enjoyable interview, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Of course, it's my pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.